Hello, I'm Vanessa. My sister looked me in the eye and said, "The wedding's $2,000 each. If you can't pay, don't come." And then she took $20,500 from my card without a word. My mom called me selfish, ungrateful, like it was my fault the family had turned into a ledger of debts and demands. I realized then that I wasn't just losing money, I was losing myself. So I ended my role as the family's ATM. But here's the question. How do you forgive people who pretend love is currency, and how far do you go when the betrayal comes from your own blood? I stared at the invitation again, my heart sinking. The wedding's $2,000 each. If you can't pay, don't come, my sister sneered. The words seemed to hang in the air like a fog I couldn't shake, heavy and suffocating. I closed my eyes and let out a slow breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions inside me. Shock, disbelief, anger, they all tangled together in a knot that refused to loosen. How had we gotten to this point, where family meant financial transactions instead of love and support? I sank into the kitchen chair, letting the paper slip from my hands to the polished oak table. The early spring sunlight streamed through the blinds, catching dust motes in the air, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside me. I thought about my rent, the student loans that never seemed to shrink, the utility bills piling up on the counter. Every month felt like walking a tightrope, balancing numbers and deadlines, and now my sister, my own sister, was treating me like some bank account she had every right to access. My mind flashed back to last Christmas. I had covered her flight tickets, helped her with the new furniture for her apartment, lent her money just this once, when her car broke down. Every time she had thanked me, but now I saw the gratitude for what it truly was, a ticket to entitlement. I shook my head, disbelief cracking my usual composure. How could someone who shared your childhood, your memories, your secrets, be this callous? The doorbell rang, and I jumped, the sudden sound slicing through my thoughts. It was my mother, come to check on me, she had said. I opened the door cautiously. She stepped inside, her expression carefully neutral, though I could sense the judgment lurking behind her eyes. "You read the invitation, I see," she said, her tone light but carrying that subtle accusation that always made me bristle. "Yes, I did," I replied evenly, "and I'm trying to figure out why you all think this is acceptable." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Vanessa, you're being selfish, ungrateful. We're only asking for a little contribution. A wedding is important, you know. Family matters." I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides. My throat burned as words I hadn't allowed myself to speak in years threatened to escape. "A little contribution?" I said, voice rising slightly. $2,000 is not a little. And calling me selfish for having a budget, for managing my own responsibilities, how is that fair?" She shook her head, tisking softly, like I was a child who didn't understand the complexities of life. But it wasn't just the wedding. My heart sank further as I remembered the bank notification I had received just an hour ago. $20,500 gone from my account. Vanished. I sank back into the chair, clutching my phone as if it were a lifeline. My fingers trembled while I scrolled through the transactions, each line confirming the impossible. My pulse raced, my stomach twisted. Someone I trusted, had drained my account. Panic surged, a tidal wave threatening to swallow my carefully constructed life. I dialed my mother's number again, hoping for some clarification, some rational explanation. "Vanessa?" She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, almost eerily so. "Mom?" I began, trying to steady my voice. $20,500. Who took it?" "I don't understand." Her sigh was heavy, a deliberate roll of disappointment. "You always think the world revolves around you. You're selfish, Vanessa. You never consider anyone else's needs." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles whitened. I just want to know where my money went. I worked for that." She shook her head again. "You don't need to worry about that right now. Just think about the wedding." And just like that, I felt the familiar sting of isolation. My own family had turned my life upside down, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I had to think, not as a victim, not as the family's convenient ATM. I needed a plan, a strategy, something that would protect me from this pattern of manipulation and entitlement. As I traced my finger along the rim of the coffee mug on the table, I felt a spark of resolve flicker to life. I remembered every time I had been asked for a favor, every loan quietly expected to be repaid with gratitude instead of consideration. The trips I had covered, the bills I had helped settle, the furniture, the car repairs, they weren't kindnesses freely given anymore. They were the currency for others to demand more, to guilt me into submission. And I had enough. I rose from the chair and walked toward the window, looking out at the suburban street bathed in soft morning light. Families walked dogs, children biked along the sidewalks, and life seemed deceptively serene. Outside, everything was calm, orderly. Inside, chaos. I could feel the tension threading through every corner of my body, a reminder that my home, my mind, my finances were mine, and mine alone. I spent the next hour making calls, the bank, my credit card company, and even a few trusted friends who might help me untangle this mess. Every ring, every conversation, every click of the keyboard felt like a small victory reclaiming the control I had lost. I could feel my mind sharpening, formulating strategies, thinking 3 steps ahead. I wasn't powerless. I was resourceful, intelligent, and capable. As the morning faded into early afternoon, I sat back at my desk, scanning through the wedding invitation one more time. My sister's smug tone, the motherly chastisement, the betrayal of my own finances, all of it boiled together. I realized then, in that quiet clarity that only shock and frustration can bring, that my family's expectations were no longer my responsibility. I had to protect myself, emotionally and financially, and that meant drawing firm boundaries, something I had never truly done before. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sunlight warm my face, and thought of all the ways I had been taken for granted. The anger simmered, but it was tempered by resolve. This wasn't about revenge, this was about survival and self-respect. Somewhere between rage and disbelief, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't their ATM anymore. The phone on the table buzzed, and I glanced at it, expecting another futile message. Instead, it was a text from my sister. "Hope you reconsider. Family comes first." I stared at the screen, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. Family came first. Yes, but not at the cost of my dignity, my security, my life. I stood, straightening my shoulders, and for the first time that morning, felt a sense of clarity. The first echoes of confrontation were already forming in my mind, and I knew I couldn't let it slide. I had to be strategic, calm, and deliberate. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be pleasant, but it was necessary. My family had crossed a line, and it was time I drew one in return. Ah, I'm Vanessa, and I finally understood that ignoring them wasn't an option. I had to face my sister before this spiraled further. I sat down on the edge of my sofa, the wedding invitation still clutched in my hand, and let out a slow breath. The morning sun streamed through the half-open blinds, casting stripes across my living room, but the warmth felt distant, almost ironic given the chill settling in my chest. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I set the invitation down on the coffee table and let my mind drift back, unwilling yet compelled, to all the times I had quietly carried the weight of my family's crises, paying for my brother's first semester of college when my own student loans loomed like dark clouds, covering my mother's unexpected hospital bills, even loaning my sister money, just until next week, that never seemed to come back. Each memory pressed against my chest, a familiar ache, reminding me that generosity in my family had often been mistaken for weakness. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would chase some of the tension away. The aroma did little to soothe the rising storm inside me. How had I let it go this far without demanding respect? My mind played through every scenario of confrontation, weighing my words, rehearsing my tone. I knew that any misstep could turn a simple discussion into an all-out battle of manipulation and guilt-tripping, but enough was enough. I picked up the phone, my fingers hovering over my sister's number longer than necessary. I could hear her in my mind, her voice sharp and mocking. "Oh, Vanessa, Always trying to play the responsible one. Can't handle a little family fun. That voice alone made my stomach knot, but it also steeled me. I pressed dial. The line rang twice before she picked up. Hello? Her tone was deceptively casual, but I could sense the smirk waiting on the other end. Hi, it's me, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to talk about the money that's missing from my account. A pause. Then, her laughter, light and cruel. Missing money? Vanessa, you worry too much. I think you're overreacting. Why don't you take a deep breath and relax? Relax? I felt my teeth grit together, but I didn't allow myself to snap. $2,500 doesn't just disappear. I want to know where it went, and I want it back. Her chuckle deepened. Oh, Vanessa, always so serious. You think you're smarter than everyone else, don't you? Always counting every dollar, making plans like some kind of banker. It's really amusing. My chest tightened. Her tone, so familiar, had the same sharp edge I'd grown up with, one that could turn affection into ridicule in an instant. This isn't a joke, I said firmly. I've supported this family for years, and I've been patient, but I'm done being used. I need answers, and I need them now. There was a silence that felt too long, the kind that makes the blood rush in your ears. Then she spoke, slow and deliberate. Vanessa, think carefully. Do you really want everyone to know what's happened? The warning hung in the air like a storm cloud. I set my coffee down, my hand trembling slightly. I wasn't naive. I understood the leverage she thought she held. But this time, I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. I had spent too many years bending around the whims and manipulations of my family. I had to protect myself. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the memories wash over me again. The birthday gifts I bought that went unacknowledged, the nights I stayed up to help with applications or bills, the unspoken expectations that I would always step in, always cover the gap. I realized, painfully, that my generosity had been exploited, and I could no longer ignore it. Opening my eyes, I made a silent vow. No more lending, no more excuses, no more quiet sacrifices that left me feeling depleted and unappreciated. I would enforce consequences, legally if I had to. I would take every step necessary to ensure that my financial independence and my dignity remained intact. I grabbed my laptop and began drafting emails, making notes of transactions, dates, and amounts. I researched legal avenues, bank policies, and potential recourse. Each click and keystroke grounded me, turning panic into strategy. Even as anger burned behind my eyes, it sharpened my focus instead of blinding me. A glance at the clock reminded me that time was moving forward, indifferent to my turmoil. I needed a plan, and the plan began with a confrontation that I would not back away from. My sister's threats were intended to unsettle me, but they only reinforced the necessity of my next steps. By early afternoon, I had a clear outline in my mind: document, confront, protect. But I also knew that the emotional battlefield would be just as challenging as the financial one. Families wield familiarity like a weapon, and I had to anticipate every curveball. My heart pounded at the thought of the confrontation, yet a strange clarity settled over me. I was no longer the girl who silently absorbed every slight. I was ready to stand, to assert, to protect the life I had built. I reached for my phone again, not to call my sister this time, but to confirm appointments with a financial advisor and legal consultant. Each step was a reminder that I was reclaiming control, establishing boundaries that had long been ignored. The thought that they might retaliate, spread rumors, or twist facts made my stomach flutter, but it didn't intimidate me. I was prepared. And yet, a sliver of caution reminded me that this was only the beginning. The first move had to be deliberate, precise. Every interaction could ripple through the family, every word potentially weaponized. But I was ready to navigate it, ready to face the storm without faltering. I picked up the wedding invitation one more time, holding it between my fingers like a challenge. The bright colors, the carefully printed names, even the absurd financial demand, All of it felt like a microcosm of a family that had consistently misunderstood respect and boundaries. And I, finally, understood that the only way forward was direct, uncompromising confrontation. Somewhere between anger and resolve, I realized a truth that felt both terrifying and liberating. I wasn't their ATM anymore. My heart raced, but I knew hiding wasn't an option. This had to end, one way or another. I paced around my apartment for a few minutes, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the walls, and I realized that the quiet of my home now felt suffocating. My phone sat on the counter, screen cracked in one corner, yet mocking me silently. It was both my weapon and my anchor. I grabbed it and dialed my sister's number, even though the memory of her smirk from earlier still burned in my mind. The line rang longer than I expected. When she finally answered, her tone was annoyingly casual. "Vanessa, everything okay?" she asked, pretending innocence. "I'm done pretending," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I want to meet. Today. We need to talk about the money." A pause. Then laughter. Not the friendly kind, but the one that cut through your bones. "Oh, sweetie, you really think I'd let that slide? You're so predictable." "Fine, come over. Let's see what you've got." After hanging up, I felt both dread and determination. I needed to be careful. Every move I made had to be deliberate. I grabbed my coat, made a quick coffee, and jotted down points I wouldn't let myself forget. No excuses, no apologies for demanding what was mine. This time, I wouldn't let past patterns of being taken advantage of repeat. On my way out, I paused by the window and looked at the familiar streets of my Northern California neighborhood. The afternoon sun glinted off cars, children laughed in the distance, and everything seemed normal, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. My past flashed in my mind. The times I had covered her tuition fees, the emergency bills I had quietly handled, the moments when my generosity had been met with entitlement rather than gratitude. Each memory tightened the knot in my stomach, but also fueled a quiet rage. I wasn't just angry about the stolen money. I was angry about being undervalued, underestimated, and dismissed for years. I decided to take the scenic route to her apartment. Walking through the leafy streets helped me think, allowed me to rehearse what I'd say. By the time I arrived, my mind had cycled through anger, strategy, and then something steadier, resolve. I knocked, and when she opened the door, her smile was like a dagger wrapped in sugar. "Vanessa, you actually came," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I did," I replied, not bothering to mirror her fake warmth. "We need to talk, now." The living room smelled faintly of vanilla and old wood polish. We sat across from each other, the air thick with unspoken accusations. I pulled out the envelope of bank statements I had printed earlier, the evidence neatly organized. "You think this little stunt of yours is clever?" she sneered. "Do you really believe you're the only one who has ever worked hard in this family?" "I'm not trying to be clever," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm trying to be fair. You took money that wasn't yours. That's not clever. It's theft." Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward. "Oh, so now you're the moral compass, the smart, independent one who everyone else must follow. Please, Vanessa, don't act like you're the saint here." I felt the familiar heat of frustration rise, but I forced myself to breathe. I wouldn't let her provoke me into saying something I'd regret. "I'm not claiming to be a saint," I said. "I'm claiming accountability, something that's been missing in this family for far too long." Our conversation was interrupted when my mother's voice came from the hallway, sharp and tinged with disappointment. "Vanessa, must you always be so dramatic? Your sister didn't mean—" "I'm not being dramatic, Mom," I said, turning toward her. "I'm being honest. And for once, I'm standing up for myself, for my own boundaries. You've called me selfish before, labeled me ungrateful, but I've given and sacrificed more than anyone here realizes. And yet, when I ask for fairness, I'm made out to be the villain?" Her face hardened. "I've always tried to support everyone in this family, Vanessa. Your sister, she's done what she could. And you, always so quick to judge, so ready to criticize." I shook my head, the hurt and indignation mingling into a strange, calm determination. Supporting everyone doesn't mean tolerating theft, and love doesn't mean blind loyalty to unfairness. I've learned my lesson, Mom. I will no longer allow my generosity to be treated as weakness. The room was heavy with silence. Even my sister looked slightly unnerved, though she masked it with a haughty tilt of her chin. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years pressing on my chest, but also a lightness in the clarity I had found. This confrontation wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, respect, and finally, the courage to set boundaries. As I looked around at the people who had shaped so many of my decisions, my life, and my heart, I realized something essential. Change wouldn't be easy, and some battles weren't won in a single afternoon. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid. And then, just as I was about to leave, my sister's voice sliced through the tension like a cold wind. Think carefully, Vanessa. You wouldn't want everyone to know what's really happened. I froze. My fists clenched under my coat, my pulse drumming in my ears. She was threatening me, using my private life as leverage. My stomach sank, but this time, fear wasn't my guide. Strategy was. I could anticipate her moves, predict her manipulations, and plan my responses. I left her apartment with the evidence still in my bag and my heart pounding, not just from anger, but from the anticipation of the battles ahead. The streets felt different on my walk home, as though the sunlight now carried the weight of confrontation. I made mental notes of everything I would do next: legal advice, financial safeguards, boundaries clearly outlined in every interaction. No more being caught off guard, no more silent suffering. By the time I returned to my apartment, the sky had shifted from bright afternoon to the softer glow of early evening. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and began drafting a detailed plan. The first step was securing my finances. The second was preparing for the family meeting that would inevitably escalate. It was clear that my family had underestimated me for years. I was about to change that. And as I set my pen down, the reality settled in. They could threaten, manipulate, even try to shame me, but I would no longer shrink. My independence, my principles, and my dignity were not negotiable. I could feel the tension stretching ahead. Every confrontation, every word exchanged a potential spark. And deep down, I knew that the next moves would define not just this conflict, but the rest of my life. I clenched my fists under the table, heart pounding. If they thought I'd back down, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I couldn't let them think I'd fold. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. The words echoed in my mind as I sat back in my chair, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across my apartment. My phone buzzed again, a reminder that my siblings weren't going to wait politely for me to process their threats. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the racing pulse in my chest. I couldn't afford hesitation. Not now. After taking a few slow breaths, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the emails I had flagged earlier. My stomach sank. Some of my financial records had already been accessed without my knowledge. Small amounts, nothing catastrophic yet, but the breach confirmed that someone in my family had overstepped the line. Anger, cold and sharp, replaced the anxiety in my chest. They thought they could manipulate me by threatening my security, but they underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect myself. I knew I needed to respond immediately. I dialed my brother's number first. He picked up on the second ring, his casual tone masking the tension I knew was simmering beneath the surface. "Vanessa, what's this about you freaking out over an email?" he asked, feigning nonchalance. "I'm not freaking out," I said, keeping my voice level. "I just want to make sure we're clear. I will not tolerate threats or attempts to control my finances. Period." A laugh. "You think you can stop me? You're being dramatic. Everyone's just trying to protect what's ours." I pinched the bridge of my nose, forcing myself to remain calm. "There's a difference between protecting your interests and attempting to sabotage mine. This ends now. If anyone tries to leverage my personal information, I'll take the necessary steps to protect myself legally. I hope you understand that clearly." He chuckled again, a sound meant to mock rather than amuse. "Vanessa, you've always been the serious one, but let's see how far your seriousness gets you this time." I hung up, my hands trembling slightly. That laugh, the casual cruelty, was exactly what I feared most. But beneath that fear, I felt something stronger. Determination. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. By the time evening fell, the air had cooled, and I needed to leave my apartment before the walls felt like they were closing in. I went for a walk to clear my head, taking the familiar path to the small park near my building. The sky was streaked with the soft oranges and purples of sunset, and yet the peace of the evening did little to quiet my thoughts. I replayed every interaction, every warning, every subtle jab that had been thrown at me today. My mind was a constant reel of betrayal and deception. Halfway through the park, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call, it was a text from another sibling. My stomach tightened before I even read the message. "We're all in agreement," it read. "If you don't comply, your financial information won't stay private. Think carefully." A cold wave of shock hit me. Another ally for them. Someone else in my family had aligned themselves against me, and suddenly the isolation I felt wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. I stopped walking, my eyes scanning the park as though I might catch a hidden figure watching me. The weight of their collusion was heavy, but I forced myself to focus. Panic would serve them better than me. Returning home, I went straight to my desk. I pulled out old folders, receipts, account statements, everything that could help me track where vulnerabilities might lie. My fingers moved over the papers and keyboard with methodical precision. I couldn't change the betrayal that had occurred, but I could control my response. Flashbacks of past family meetings played in my mind. Moments when I had spoken up only to be dismissed, when my opinions were trivialized, when loyalty was demanded but never reciprocated. And now, facing this modern-day ambush, I realized something essential. My resolve was no longer negotiable. I was done being the silent, accommodating daughter. By nightfall, I had drafted messages, lined up contacts who could advise me legally, and even considered placing temporary holds on certain accounts. Every decision I made was deliberate. I refused to sink to deceit or retaliatory malice, but I would act decisively. I would reclaim my independence without losing my integrity. Then, as I was about to shut my laptop, a new email popped up. No sender name, just a subject line. "We're watching." My heart froze. I opened it carefully, reading the brief, chilling message. "Someone in your family is recording everything. Be mindful of your next moves." I stared at the screen, a cold sweat forming along my spine. This wasn't curiosity. This was leverage. Everything I had fought to protect, my autonomy, my privacy, my dignity, was now a potential tool for someone to manipulate me further. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process. There was fear, yes, but more than that, a rising tide of strategic clarity. They had underestimated me once again. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to outthink them. Every email, every step, every boundary I had established would be deliberate, calculated. I would make sure they knew, without a doubt, that I was not a woman to be cornered. The apartment grew quiet around me as the city's evening hum seeped through the windows. I traced the lines of my plan in my mind, considering all possibilities, preparing for escalation, anticipating every reaction. My fingers hovered over the keyboard again, not out of panic, but purpose. I would not be caught off guard. I would not be silenced. I would not allow fear to dictate my next moves. They might have started this game, but I was determined to finish it on my terms. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I finally allowed myself to stand, stretching the tension out of my shoulders. I glanced around my apartment, my sanctuary, my command center, my armor. Every piece of furniture, every familiar object was a reminder that this was my space, my rules. And yet, even as I felt the faint relief of control, that message lingered in my mind. Someone was watching. They had chosen their weapon carefully. My fear, my secrets, my trust. But I had something far stronger. Resolve. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. Tomorrow, I would not only defend my independence, I would assert it fully. And in doing so, I would finally draw the line that no one in my family could cross again. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the stars begin to pepper the night sky. For a moment, I let myself breathe, to appreciate the clarity and calm I had carved out amidst the storm. Then, with a steady hand, I set my glass down and returned to my desk. The night was far from over, and my strategy was just beginning. My blood ran cold as I read the message. Someone was watching, and it wasn't just curiosity. They wanted leverage. I couldn't waste a second. If they thought they could corner me, they had another thing coming. Morning light streamed weakly through the slats of my blinds, casting long, thin stripes across the floor. I lay in bed for a few moments, letting the weight of last night's revelations settle in my chest. The anonymous message wasn't just a prank. It was a clear warning. Someone in my own family was watching, waiting for me to slip. My stomach knotted at the thought, but beneath the anxiety, a spark of resolve burned. I wasn't going to let them dictate the terms of my life, not again. By the time I finally swung my legs over the side of the bed, the apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I padded to the kitchen in my slippers and brewed a strong cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me. As I sipped, my mind raced through the implications. Who could have sent that message? Who among my family had the audacity to monitor me? My eyes drifted to the laptop on the counter, the blue glow of the screen already tempting me. It was time to gather my facts, to see exactly how much of my financial life had been compromised. Sitting at the table with the laptop open, I dove into my emails and messages, cross-referencing with recent bank statements. My pulse quickened when I noticed discrepancies, small withdrawals, slightly altered records, nothing drastic yet, but enough to send a message. Whoever was behind this had access, and that meant someone close, someone who knew where to hit me. My mind flashed back to past arguments with my sibling, moments that had seemed trivial at the time, now appearing like rehearsals for this betrayal. I called my lawyer first thing, leaving a measured voicemail that carefully outlined my concerns without sounding panicked. Then I drafted a list of action points: secure accounts, notify banks, gather evidence. I reminded myself repeatedly that I was not powerless. The adrenaline coursing through me was different from fear. It was clarity, a sharp awareness that the only way forward was to act decisively. By late morning, I was out the door, walking briskly to the cafe where I had agreed to meet my sibling. The streets were alive with the quiet bustle of mid-morning errands, a contrast to the storm I carried inside me. I rehearsed my opening lines silently, calm, factual, assertive. I would not let this devolve into shouting or recrimination. I needed to be in control, not just for my own sake, but to send a clear message. Boundaries had shifted, and crossing them would have consequences. The cafe smelled of fresh bread and espresso, an oddly comforting scent. I spotted my sibling immediately, already seated with that smug half-smile that had always irked me. I slid into the chair opposite and took a breath. "We need to talk," I said plainly. My voice carried the weight of certainty, a stark contrast to the feigned casualness they were expecting. They raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "About what?" they asked, though I could see the flicker of unease in their eyes. "The financial irregularities," I said, laying out printed statements and highlighted transactions on the table between us. "These can't be ignored, and they can't be denied. I know what's been happening." For a moment, they laughed softly, a sound meant to deflect and belittle. "Vanessa, you're overreacting. It's not what you think." I met their gaze, unflinching. "Try me. These numbers don't lie, and neither do the timestamps. You can make excuses, but I'm not negotiating morality. This stops now." The tension thickened, drawing glances from the barista and a couple seated nearby. But I didn't care. I had positioned myself where they couldn't manipulate, where there was no physical intimidation, only the undeniable evidence before them. My sibling's smirk faltered, replaced by a fleeting irritation. I could see the calculus in their mind, how to twist the narrative, how to shift blame. But I was ready. I had rehearsed every angle, anticipated every diversion. After a long silence, my sibling leaned back, shoulders tight, and muttered, "You're not supposed to be this organized." "I'm supposed to protect myself," I corrected firmly. "And anyone who thinks they can threaten or manipulate me underestimates me." I left the cafe with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but also a deepening awareness that the battle was only beginning. Back in my apartment, I unpacked groceries while replaying the confrontation in my mind. Setting boundaries wasn't just about financial safeguards. It was about making clear that deceit and intimidation were unacceptable. By evening, I drafted messages to other family members, carefully explaining my actions without casting judgment, emphasizing fairness, transparency, and personal integrity. The replies came slowly, some confused, some defensive, others silently supportive. The undercurrent of tension was undeniable. Loyalties were shifting and not always in my favor, but clarity had been established, a line drawn in the sand. Just as I began to settle for the night, the intercom buzzed. A courier stood at the door, holding a sleek package with no return address. My hands froze on the doorknob as a chill traced my spine. I retrieved it carefully, setting it on the counter. The wrapping was pristine, elegant even, but the intent was unmistakable. Intimidation cloaked in civility. I examined the package, turning it slowly, every instinct alert. Whoever had sent this wanted to provoke fear, to signal that I was being watched, to make me second-guess every decision. I resisted the urge to tear it open immediately. This was a message, and I refused to react impulsively. I placed the package in view, but did not touch it further, letting its presence underscore the stakes. For the first time that day, I allowed myself a small, private smile. They might think they had leverage, but I was not going anywhere. I had acted decisively, asserted my boundaries, and maintained my ethical compass. This was my fight, and I was fully prepared to meet it head-on. By the time I opened my door, I knew this wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a full-on challenge. The package sat there, almost regal in its menacing simplicity. I didn't rush to touch it. Instead, I lingered by the doorway, eyes narrowing at the subtle details. The wrapping was flawless, the handwriting precise, almost clinical, and the faint smell of perfume that didn't belong to me lingered like a whisper of someone trying to mark their territory. I picked it up cautiously, turning it in my hands. Inside, neatly folded between thick sheets of paper, were documents that made my stomach twist. A legal notice threatening litigation if I dared contest certain family decisions, a doctored bank statement suggesting mismanagement on my part, and a single typed line that felt more like a jab than a communication. Not everyone sees the truth the way you do, Vanessa. My pulse quickened. My siblings' escalation was deliberate, methodical, and, as I suspected, public humiliation might be next. I set the papers down on my kitchen table, then moved to the living room, opening my laptop to begin a meticulous audit of every transaction, email, and record that could demonstrate my innocence. By the time I glanced at the clock, hours had slipped by. The afternoon sun was waning, painting long shadows across the apartment floor. I had no room for panic. Every thought had to be strategic. I began drafting notes, documenting the package, taking photographs, and even recording short videos explaining the timeline of events. If this descended into a legal battle, or worse, a war of reputation, I would be prepared. As I worked, my mind kept replaying the last family gathering. I could almost hear my sibling's voice cutting across the room, a rehearsed blend of charm and accusation. "Vanessa, you've always made things harder than they need to be." That was exactly what they wanted. To destabilize me, to force hesitation. But now, I knew I had the upper hand, not in sheer numbers, but in preparation and clarity. Later that afternoon, I decided I couldn't remain idle. I made my way to a small neighborhood cafe where my sibling often lingered, enjoying the illusion of control over community eyes. My approach was deliberate. I entered as if by chance, ordered a coffee, and sat in a corner with a clear view. It wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Within minutes, they spotted me, their expression flickering from surprise to irritation and finally settling into something dangerously composed. "Vanessa," they said, their tone light, but the edge in their eyes betrayed calculation. "Didn't expect to see you here." I didn't rise to bait. Instead, I laid a folder on the table. "I thought we should review some details together," I said calmly. "It's better for everyone if we're transparent." They glanced at it, skimming just enough to realize the depth of preparation I had invested. Their usual deflections, dismissive laughter, insinuations of incompetence meant nothing but my steady gaze. I could feel the tension in their posture, the mental recalibration happening in real time. Around us, the cafe carried on with its afternoon rhythm, oblivious to the quiet confrontation at one table. "You're overreacting," they said finally, attempting control. "There's no need to escalate this." I leaned in slightly, voice measured but firm. "Overreacting. Look at this. Every detail is verifiable. Every claim you've made publicly and privately can be traced. I won't ignore attempts to undermine me, and I won't allow manipulation of our shared network of friends and family. These behaviors stop now." Their lips twitched, half in a smirk, half in suppressed frustration. "You think this changes anything?" "I know it does," I said, keeping my tone even. "And if it doesn't, you'll learn that consequences aren't threats, they're actions. I'm done negotiating with ambiguity." The remaining minutes were a careful balance of presence and assertion. I left the cafe before the conversation could escalate into theatrics, carrying with me a quiet satisfaction that comes from asserting control. I had drawn a line in the sand, one that was visible, undeniable, and unyielding. Returning to my apartment as twilight approached, I felt the weight of the day settle in my shoulders. My actions had been decisive, but I couldn't allow myself complacency. Sitting down at the kitchen table once more, I reviewed my notes and photographs again, ensuring everything was chronologically accurate and backed by evidence. I double-checked my lawyer's email, confirming a scheduled review of the materials, and updated my personal log with observations from the encounter. As darkness crept over the city, my phone buzzed with a message that made me pause mid-sip of water. It wasn't aggressive or overtly threatening, just a calm line of text. "We're not finished yet. Consider this your first warning." I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the words sink in. There was no panic, no confusion, only recognition. They hadn't relented, and now it was clear they were escalating. But neither had I. My preparation, my strategic reflection, and my refusal to cower had established a new reality. I was no longer a passive participant in their games. I closed my laptop, the room dark except for the soft glow of the streetlights outside. My reflection in the window showed determination more than fear. I would protect myself, uphold my integrity, and face whatever came next without hesitation. The voice on the other end of that message might have been calm, but I felt the threat radiate through the line. I knew this was far from over. And as I stood by the window, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling into the night, I made a silent vow. The next move wouldn't catch me unprepared. Whatever confrontation awaited, I would meet it on my terms. I stepped outside, feeling the weight of every choice I'd made, knowing tonight could change everything. The evening air was cooler than I expected, a subtle reminder that the world outside my apartment didn't pause for personal crises. My heels clicked against the sidewalk as I walked toward the corner cafe, a place I often used to think, plan, and, tonight, prepare for confrontation. Every step carried a mixture of anxiety and clarity. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions any longer. As I reached the cafe, I found a quiet corner and spread out the folders I'd brought. Legal notices, screenshots of messages, photographs of incidents, and personal notes chronicling every subtle insult and financial manipulation my sibling had subjected me to. I carefully reviewed each piece of evidence, my mind racing but precise. "This is everything," I murmured to myself, flipping through the pages. Nothing left unaccounted for. There was a meticulous rhythm to my preparation, almost soothing, a counterbalance to the tension knotting my chest. By the time I left the cafe, twilight had settled over the neighborhood. I walked slowly, using the fading light to scan the streets and make sure no unexpected eyes followed me. As I approached my car, my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. I didn't answer, but a part of me noted the timing. Whoever it was, they had chosen the moment I stepped out, probably aware of the stakes. Driving home, I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind. I imagined every scenario, my sibling attempting a public humiliation, planting rumors, trying to provoke me in front of friends or family. I felt a surge of determination. I wouldn't just respond, I would control the narrative. My resolve wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming my agency. When I arrived at home, I immediately set up a workspace in the living room, gathering additional materials, my laptop, extra copies of documentation, and a recording device just in case. I knew that if this escalated into a public spectacle, I had to be prepared, not reactive. As I organized my notes, my phone buzzed again, this time a text from a mutual acquaintance. "Are you okay? Heard some things. About tonight." I typed a quick reassurance, careful not to reveal my strategy. Night fell fully, bringing with it a quiet intensity. I made my way to my siblings' residence, each step deliberate. The street was nearly empty, the occasional neighbor passing by with nods of polite acknowledgement. I approached the door with a mixture of apprehension and focus, reminding myself, every action must be calculated. The door opened before I could knock. My siblings stood there, a smirk playing across their face, as if they had been expecting me. "Well, well, look who finally decided to show up," they said, voice dripping with feigned surprise. Their words were a thinly veiled attempt to provoke, to elicit a reaction. I took a slow breath, meeting their gaze with calm resolve. "We need to talk," I said firmly, stepping inside without hesitation. The living room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls. My sibling tried to unsettle me immediately, pointing to a few photographs on a shelf. "Do you really think everyone believes your version of events?" they asked, the tone more challenging than any previous encounter. I didn't flinch. Instead, I calmly placed my folder on the coffee table, sliding it toward them. "You'll see," I said, my voice steady. "Everything is documented. Witnesses, dates, messages, there's no ambiguity left." Their smirk faltered slightly as they skimmed the contents, realizing this was not the same Vanessa they had tried to intimidate for months. I could see the tension rise in their posture, the forced composure cracking. I continued, laying out each point: emotional manipulation, financial deception, social sabotage, all meticulously chronicled. "This ends tonight," I said, making eye contact, ensuring the weight of my words sank in. At that moment, the doorbell rang. I had arranged for a trusted friend and a legal advisor to be nearby, ensuring the confrontation remained accountable. My siblings' eyes widened, recognition and panic flashing across their face. They knew this wasn't a private conversation anymore. Witnesses were present, and there was no turning back. I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every word counted. "You've had your chance to manipulate, to intimidate, to spread lies. Tonight, it stops. There will be consequences if this behavior continues." My tone wasn't threatening. It was declarative, rooted in certainty and moral authority. I could see the realization settling in. Control had shifted. Hours seemed to compress as the conversation progressed. My sibling attempted a few desperate maneuvers, half questions, half accusations, but I deflected with evidence, clarity, and composure. Every attempt to provoke anger from me failed. I remained unshakable. By the time the discussion ended, a quiet acknowledgement hung in the room. My sibling was subdued, their social power visibly diminished in the presence of witnesses. Walking out into the night, the cool air felt like a cleansing balm. I had maintained my dignity, asserted my boundaries, and reclaimed control over a situation that had been escalating for months. Yet, as I reached my car, I couldn't ignore the lingering ache of familial betrayal, a reminder that some wounds, though addressed, take longer to heal. As I drove back home under the quiet glow of streetlights, I felt a cautious optimism building. I had faced the storm, and while the sky remained clouded with unresolved tension, I knew I had navigated it with integrity and strength. Tonight was a turning point, a statement that I would no longer be silenced, humiliated, or manipulated. Pulling into my driveway, I paused for a moment, letting the engine idle. The world was quiet, almost deceptively calm, but I knew the impact of tonight's confrontation would ripple outward. I stepped out of the car, the night air settling around me like a promise. Every choice I had made, every moment of preparation, had led to this. And though the family wounds were far from completely healed, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. The phone buzzed once more, a brief message from an unknown number. I didn't open it immediately. Tonight, I had already taken control. The storm wasn't gone, but for the first time in months, I wasn't running from it. I had faced it head on and survived with my principles intact. I walked inside, feeling the solid weight of accomplishment and the quiet anticipation of what tomorrow might bring. This chapter of conflict had concluded, but the story, like all family ties, was far from over. I had reclaimed my agency, and in doing so, had set the stage for healing, boundaries, and self-respect. Morning light felt heavy on my shoulders, reminding me that last night's storm had only shifted, not disappeared. I lingered by the window, watching the golden rays hit the sidewalk outside. There was a certain calm, deceptive in its softness, the kind that masks the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling its warmth seep into my hands, and let my mind replay the events from the night before, the confrontation, the controlled anger, the satisfaction that came from standing my ground. Yet, even as I felt relief, I knew the next steps would demand careful calculation. I lingered over a stack of notes on the kitchen table, emails, text messages, screenshots, witness statements I had meticulously organized. The documents were more than evidence. They were reminders of every subtle maneuver my sibling had used over the years, trying to discredit me, to sow doubt about my integrity. I ran my finger along the edge of the top sheet, considering my strategy. Today, everything would either solidify or unravel. By mid-morning, I had packed the folder into my tote and stepped out into the brisk air. My first stop was a small cafe 2 blocks away, a place I frequented when I needed to think without interruption. Settling into a corner, I watched patrons drift in and out, absorbed in their own routines, their own minor victories and defeats. I reviewed my notes again, making mental rehearsals of phrases I might use during the family mediation. The idea of sitting across from my sibling, seeing them attempt their usual smirk or manipulative charm, made my stomach tighten, but I refused to let it show. Control, I reminded myself. Control. The afternoon sun had begun to fade when I returned home briefly to drop off the folder. I paused at the door, taking a moment to center myself. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every memory. I thought of my parents' voices, my siblings' sneers, the long hours spent proving myself not just to the world, but to the family I had grown up in. I straightened my shoulders, reminding myself that I was stepping into this confrontation not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone asserting her own truth. With that, I grabbed my coat and headed toward the car. Traffic was light as I drove to my siblings' residence, and I found solace in the rhythm of the engine, the familiar sights of the neighborhood blurring past. I rehearsed my points, anticipating the potential traps, accusations about my character, attempts to twist past conversations, appeals to relatives who might otherwise side with me. But this time, I was prepared. Each word I intended to speak had a purpose. Each gesture was intentional. I arrived at their doorstep just as the sky began to darken, the late afternoon casting long shadows across the lawn. My sibling opened the door with a polite smile that didn't reach their eyes. "Vanessa," they said, voice smooth, almost teasing. "You look determined." I returned their gaze steadily, refusing to let them unsettle me. "I am," I said simply. "We need to talk." We moved to the living room, where a few neighbors, who had witnessed previous incidents, were quietly seated on the sofa. Their presence was subtle, yet pivotal. I knew their observation would keep the conversation grounded. My sibling tried their usual opening gambit, sarcastic remarks, feigned innocence, half-truths twisted into accusations, but I was ready. I presented the folder, page by page, summarizing the evidence, keeping my tone calm but firm. I could see the shift immediately. The casual arrogance faded, replaced by a careful calculation, a recognition that their usual manipulations were no longer effective. "You're being dramatic," my sibling finally said, trying a last-ditch effort to provoke an emotional response. I let them speak without interruption, then responded, "I'm being honest. I'm giving everyone here the facts. You've had opportunities to address these issues privately, and you chose not to. Now we face the reality together." My voice was steady, unwavering. The tension was palpable, each word cutting through the silence. I watched my siblings squirm, glancing at the witnesses, realizing that the support I had built, the meticulous documentation, and my controlled demeanor left them cornered. They attempted a final manipulation, invoking memories of past disagreements, hinting at supposed betrayals, but I held firm. My responses were concise, factual, and imbued with the calm authority I had cultivated over months of preparation. After an hour, the air had shifted. My siblings' attempts to dominate or discredit me had failed. There was no dramatic outburst, no emotional collapse, only a slow acknowledgement in their eyes that the power dynamic had changed. The witnesses nodded subtly, signaling their recognition of fairness and reason. I felt a quiet triumph, not born of vengeance, but of clarity and strength. As I stepped outside into the cooling evening, the streetlights casting long, reflective shadows, I realized that the confrontation had been decisive. My sibling was subdued, their influence diminished, yet there remained a subtle ache of sadness. Family bonds, once strained by deception and manipulation, had not fully healed, but they could now be addressed with honesty. The empowerment I felt was intertwined with a cautious hope that the future could allow for repair, whether through reconciliation or continued firm boundaries. Driving home, I reflected on the subtle shifts, the way neighbors had glanced with respect, the restrained acknowledgement in my siblings' posture. I allowed myself a slow breath, savoring the sense of having acted with integrity and strength. Still, I knew that emotional battles lingered, scars would remain. Life had not returned to perfect calm, but I had reclaimed control over the aspects I could influence. Back at my apartment, I unpacked my bag, carefully placing the folder in a locked drawer. I made tea and settled into my favorite chair by the window, watching the night sky deep into indigo. The world outside was quiet, yet alive with the ongoing rhythms of life, cars passing, distant laughter, the rustle of leaves. I exhaled slowly, allowing the tension to drain from my body, knowing I had won the immediate battle, but that the war with my own heart, the work of forgiveness, understanding, and continued vigilance, was only beginning. The night stretched on, carrying a sense of closure alongside the lingering hum of unresolved emotions. I allowed myself to feel pride without arrogance, relief without complacency. Each challenge I had faced, each manipulation countered, strengthened the resolve that I could navigate this family, this life, with intelligence, empathy, and courage. And as I finally turned off the lights, the world outside seemed poised to greet me with both trials and possibilities, and I was ready. The sun spilled across my kitchen counter, warm and patient, as if the world itself was giving me one last chance to breathe. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma curling into the quiet room, and sat at the table, letting the morning light settle over me. For the first time in days, I didn't feel the weight of confrontation pressing on my shoulders. Instead, there was a strange stillness, a moment suspended between yesterday's battles and whatever tomorrow would bring. I thought about my sibling, about their words last night, and the look in their eyes when I held my ground. Pride mixed with desperation. They were caught between defiance and an awkward acknowledgement that the game was over. My chest tightened as memories of all the arguments, the manipulation, and the betrayals came rushing back. I realized then that the anger I'd carried for so long had not just been for them, but for myself as well, for staying silent too many times, for letting their actions erode my confidence. After finishing my coffee, I made a conscious decision not to linger in self-pity. I tidied the kitchen slowly, methodically, letting each movement be a small act of reclaiming control over my space and my mind. The phone buzzed, a message from my friend Claire, checking in after yesterday's family confrontation. Her words were warm but cautious, and I felt a small wave of gratitude. Even amidst chaos, there were people who saw me clearly, who supported the version of myself I wanted to be. By late morning, I decided to reach out to my sister, not my sibling from yesterday's storm, but a distant family member who had been quietly observing, hoping to mediate without stepping on toes. I knew a careful conversation could help ease lingering tensions. Sitting down at the kitchen table with my laptop, I drafted a message that balanced honesty and restraint. I didn't want to provoke defensiveness, yet I needed my voice heard. The words were deliberate: acknowledgement of past mistakes, an invitation for dialogue, and a boundary that could not be crossed. The response came quicker than I expected. My cousin, always the level-headed one, suggested meeting at a quiet cafe downtown. The thought of leaving the house, of stepping into public space with family matters laid bare, made my stomach flutter. But in a good way. It felt like moving forward instead of retreating. By early afternoon, I was in the car, driving through familiar streets that now seemed softer under the sunlight, as if the world itself had shifted to accommodate the new chapter I was opening. I arrived at the cafe, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked bread mingling with the late summer air, and spotted my cousin waving from a corner table. We exchanged greetings, light but genuine, and soon the conversation turned to the family tensions that had dominated recent weeks. I listened as my cousin recounted what they had seen, the subtle signs of remorse from some relatives, the cautious curiosity in others. "They're looking at you differently now," my cousin said, sipping their tea. "Not all of them, but enough to notice that you've drawn a line." I nodded, letting the validations sink in. It was empowering to recognize that my actions had consequences beyond the immediate conflict, rippling quietly through those around me. After the cafe meeting, I walked home slowly, taking detours through familiar streets. I stopped at the park where I used to read as a child, watching the soft sway of tree branches and the occasional dog chasing a ball. A part of me wanted to pause here forever, but I knew life demanded movement. There were conversations still to be had, decisions still to be made. My sibling had not yet fully confronted the repercussions of their choices, and I needed to ensure accountability without becoming the person I despised. By late afternoon, I returned home and picked up the phone again, this time calling the sibling who had caused so much chaos. My voice was calm, measured, firm. "We need to talk," I said. Silence stretched for a moment, then came the familiar mix of reluctance and recognition in their tone. We arranged to meet at my home that evening. I spent the intervening hours reviewing everything: documents, messages, reminders of incidents that could no longer be ignored. My preparation wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity, about creating a space where truth could be confronted without distortion. As evening descended, I lit a few lamps and opened the living room to soft music, a background for a conversation that could shift everything. My sibling arrived, cautious, eyes flicking around as if expecting another ambush. I met their gaze steadily. "I want to be clear," I began. "This is not about anger. This is about understanding, responsibility, and moving forward in a way that respects everyone involved." The discussion that followed was tense. They attempted their usual tactics: half-truths, subtle blame, the familiar attempts to sway perception. I remained composed, countering each point with evidence, reason, and a calm insistence on accountability. Every so often, I caught a flicker of vulnerability, a fleeting glimpse of the person who had been hiding behind manipulation all these years. I acknowledged it without softening my stance. "I'm not here to destroy you," I said, "but I will not let this continue unchecked." Hours passed. The room shifted from confrontation to reluctant dialogue, the anger giving way to reflection. My sibling, exhausted, quieted, and for the first time, I sensed genuine consideration in their responses. They were not fully changed, perhaps, but they had seen a mirror they could not ignore. By the time they left, the tension had diffused, replaced by a tentative understanding that lines had been drawn and boundaries would be respected. I sat back after the door closed, a deep exhale releasing months of pent-up stress. Relief washed over me, tinged with a bittersweet recognition of what had been lost along the way. Yet there was hope now, fragile but persistent. I spent the next few minutes reviewing the day, acknowledging the growth in myself, the courage to confront, the patience to guide, and the clarity to maintain integrity without compromise. Night fell gently outside my window, and I moved to the small balcony, looking at the stars blinking quietly above. I thought of the future, of choices still waiting to be made, of family dynamics that might heal slowly but surely. There would always be scars, but they were part of a story that I had survived, shaped, and learned from. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the night breeze on my face, and let a quiet smile form. The battles had been fought, the lessons hard-earned. The path ahead was mine to navigate, guided by strength, moral clarity, and an unwavering respect for myself. Even as I acknowledged that some wounds would never fully fade, I understood that resilience was more than endurance. It was the ability to reclaim life, moment by moment, choice by choice. I stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the home I had carved out with intention, a sanctuary where my voice mattered and my boundaries were honored. The past was a chapter, the present a canvas, and the future, despite its uncertainties, was a space where I could thrive on my own terms. I stepped outside the next morning, feeling the sunlight on my face, knowing the past couldn't define me, and that even though some wounds would never fully heal, my life was mine to shape. Before we wrap up, let this story remind us that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Family shouldn't be a place where your generosity is taken for granted or your trust is abused. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to set firm boundaries with loved ones? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your experiences. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story where real-life drama meets lessons we can all learn from.